of Shadows Blair Witch 2 is directed by Joe Berlinger, written by him and Dick Beebe, and stars Jeffrey Donovan, Erica Learson, Stephen Barker Turner, Tristan Schuyler, and Kim Director. In Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2 takes place in the quote-unquote real world where the Blair Witch Project actually came out as a film, and this group of people in this movie travel to the same Maryland woods where the movie took place to go ghost hunting, and bad stuff happens to them. That's really all I can say about this plot. Now, I was actually somewhat on the fence about watching this movie in the sense that I had heard about how bad it was, but at the same time, when I read the premise and what this movie was actually about, I was admittedly interested because I had no idea that the sequel to Blair Witch Project was sort of like a meta-sequel, and I thought that was an interesting place to take a horror sequel, especially with all the hype surrounding the Blair Witch Project. But I really just should have not watched this movie because Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2 is one of the worst movies ever made. And I rarely say that about some movies, but when I say it, I mean it, and I totally mean it. This is one of the worst movies I've ever seen. Just everything about it is wrong. It feels like a 90-minute MTV music video. It has horrendous and unintentionally hilarious acting, and it has a story that is one of the most incomprehensible pieces of crap I've ever seen on screen. Let's get this out of the way. Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2 is not a found footage film. Does it make it any better? Absolutely not. It uses conventional camera setups, but somehow comes off looking even worse than the first. And the first one, it had its authentic look, and it was chilling because of that. Here, everything just looks super fake, and you're not invested in any of it. There's no artfulness to the way it's shot, the blood effects are totally unconvincing, and if you've ever seen this movie, I think it was also released in the early 2000s, called Ginger Snaps, which is it was like a werewolf, a horror comedy sort of thing, like a coming of age movie, and it had this really cool sort of DIY aesthetic. Book of Shadows has that same aesthetic, but it doesn't have the attitude to back it up. Also, Ginger Snaps is actually just a really good movie, and this is not. The only real visual effect in this movie is this little girl who flails her arms around like one of those fan-powered promotional things that you see outside of stores. I don't know what you call them, but I'm just gonna show it to you. I know I looked really stupid just now, but I promise you this whole movie looks even worse. And for a movie that dares use the words Blair Witch in its title, they barely even stay in the woods in this movie, and when they are in the woods, it feels like a set. It feels like they never got the permits to use the actual forest. Instead, most of this movie takes place in a barren warehouse that is just wholly visually unappealing. The sound in the movie is really lame as well, in that the attempted jump scares in this movie don't even have the impact in the sound to, really scare you out of your seats. There's nothing scary about this movie. There's no more simple, creepy sound editing that really made the first movie so effective. And the sound mix itself is really uneven and sometimes just downright out of sync. And I was really kind of shocked when the opening credits were coming up and I saw that the original score here was done by Carter Burwell. Carter Burwell just got nominated for an Oscar for his work on Carol, and his score here is just completely non-existent. You don't really notice it at all. Instead, what you do notice is the completely obnoxious soundtrack of Book of Shadows. There are just so many really loud rock songs that are just not used, I think, the way they should have been used. The soundtrack here really, to me, represents the worst of the MTV generation. It just comes off as really annoying and, really angsty, and they totally bastardize a couple of songs from Marilyn Manson and Queens of the Stone Age, and I love both of those bands, and the way they're used in this movie, they just don't fit their scenes, and it just does not, really show the depth of Marilyn Manson or Queens of the Stone Age. And now we get to the editing. The editing in this movie is done by Sarah Flack, and it's truly some of the worst editing I've ever seen in the 22 years I've been alive. Overall, the pace is really slow. It has zero suspense building up to any of its scares, which are not scary in any way, and there's no sense of point of view in this movie. And as Bridget Jones's Diary has taught us, which I just reviewed, point of view is important for, latching onto a character emotionally. And here, you're really just not emotionally engaged in anything. There's no actual build-up in the mystery that's happening, and I swear to God, the shots in this movie are sequenced seemingly at random, and that's not just a figure of speech. I really feel like they randomly put together a bunch of shots to just string it out into a 90-minute film. The entire movie has shots from 3 different places. Shots from the main plot with these characters, shots from a bunch of blurry flashbacks or flash forwards, and shots from scenes where the characters are being interrogated. And I swear that there's literally no rhyme or reason to the way these shots are sequenced. I really believe that you can watch this movie out of order, jumping around the timeline, and it'll still make as much sense as when you watch it from beginning to end. And one of the worst things about Book of Shadows, which is already a movie that's full of horrible things, is the fact that it tries to be a psychological thriller, but there is literally zero causality among all the events that happen, which again supports my idea that you can watch this movie out of order and it'll still make quote-unquote sense. And I know that some people out there are gonna say that, there are certain types of movies where you have to sit down and really, analyze the events that are happening, but I swear, this is not one of those movies. Nothing makes sense. No event really leads up to anything else, and there's no emotions carried over from one scene to the next. It feels like a bunch of random scenes from 100 different movies strung together horribly. And if you're a fan of the first movie like I am, there is nothing for you here, because this movie has almost nothing to do with the Blair Witch. The movie has the gall to open with documentary footage just like the first movie, but, it really serves no purpose. There is no attempt at world building here or deepening the lore. In fact, the Blair Witch is only mentioned once in a while to maybe give this movie a little bit of credibility, but it really comes off as a desperate excuse for them to slap on the title Blair Witch. And the characters in the movie are the most unlikable and annoying people you've ever seen. You just kind of want to see them die. In fact, well, you don't really want to see anything happen to them because you couldn't care less about any of them. The dialogue is horrible and it feels unnatural. It never feels like they're actual human beings, but the most disappointing thing about the writing here is that this movie easily could have been satirical, especially given the success of the Blair Witch Project. However, the movie is caught between wanting to be a satire, wanting to be an homage to the Blair Witch Project, and wanting to be a generic horror movie, and it can't pick, so it sucks at doing all 3. With regard to the actors, it's really difficult for me to distinguish among all the 5 main actors here because everyone acts the same. They all overact and they all state their lines really over-emphatically, and I legitimately found myself laughing throughout this movie because the acting was just so terrible. And when I wasn't laughing, I was wincing in pain and secondhand embarrassment. But by far my favorite actor in this movie is this guy Lanny Flaherty, who plays the sheriff, and I'm convinced that he knew that this movie was going to be terrible, so he overpronounces his words all the time, and it is the funniest thing. But really, all these actors, they can't even sell being scared and make it seem real. Their emotions are never cumulative. You never feel like how they feel in one scene feeds into the next scene. And I never thought I would say it, but the director here, Joe Berlinger, really should have just stuck to the found footage format. I think it would have been better. Or if not better, I just feel like limiting his mode of filmmaking in this movie would have given him less space to ruin things. Right off the bat, at the very opening frame of the film, this movie states that it's not a found footage movie, but it's a dramatization of real events, which is like the first red flag which should tell you to give up on this movie immediately. It's directed like a music video all throughout, with the camera zooming and panning endlessly, and it's somehow more disorienting than the first film. There is no imagination to the scares, if you can even call them scares. There's sudden shifts in tone, and the overall vibe is similar to listening to an angsty teenager discovering metal music for the first time and thinking he's the coolest person in the world. It is that annoying and it is that insufferable, and you should avoid it at all costs. Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2 is terrible. Just never see it. It was a product of greed because these people wanted to cash in on the success of the first film, and it worked. That's the worst part. They made a ton of cash, so I hope you're happy about it. Alright, so those are my thoughts on Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2. If you guys have seen it, which I hope you haven't, please tell me what you thought about it, and whether you agree with me or not, please leave me a comment. Let's have a conversation.